The train whistle cut through the fog like a knife through silk. It was September 17th, 1943, and Thomas Whitmore stood on the platform at King's Cross Station, his 7-year-old son clutching his hand so tightly that both their palms had gone damp. The boy, William, named after Thomas's father, had been silent the entire journey from their small flat in Islington, but now his breathing had become rapid, shallow, the kind that comes before tears. Thomas knelt down, his uniform rough against William's cheek as he pulled the boy close. The wool smelled of mothballs and hope, freshly issued just 3 days prior. Around them, the platform churned with 100 similar scenes. Fathers and sons, husbands and wives, all suspended in those terrible final moments before separation becomes real. The war had already taken so much from London. The Blitz had ended 2 years ago, but the scars remained, visible in the gaps between buildings like missing teeth in an old man's smile. "Listen to me, Billy," Thomas whispered, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "I need you to be brave. Can you do that for me?" William nodded, but his lower lip trembled. He was wearing the gray shorts and white shirt that his mother, Margaret, had carefully ironed the night before, her hands shaking so badly she'd had to start over 3 times. She stood a few feet away now, her face a mask of composure that was cracking at the edges. She'd already said her goodbyes at home, unable to trust herself at the station. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden horse, no bigger than his thumb, carved during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. He'd smoothed every edge until it was perfect, safe for small hands. "This is courage," he said, pressing it into William's palm. "As long as you have him, a part of me is with you. And I promise you, Billy, I promise on everything I am, I will come back to you." The smile that spread across Thomas's face then was legendary in its own way. It wasn't false exactly. It was willed into existence through sheer determination, a father's last gift to his son, the memory of happiness instead of fear. His eyes crinkled at the corners, and for just a moment, William smiled back. "That's my boy," Thomas said. "Now, I want you to help your mother while I'm gone. You're the man of the house now." The whistle blew again. Final call. All around them, men were breaking away from their families, boarding the train that would take them to Southampton, then to the ships, then to Italy, where Field Marshal Montgomery was pushing north against the German defensive lines. The newspapers called it the Italian campaign. The soldiers called it hell with mountains. Thomas stood, kissed Margaret one last time, her lips cold against his, and turned toward the train. He climbed the steps, found a window, pressed his hand against the glass. William ran alongside as the train began to move, his small legs pumping, the wooden horse clutched in his fist. Thomas kept smiling, kept waving, even as his son became smaller and smaller, until the platform curved away and there was nothing but smoke and distance. He never saw his son's face again. But he couldn't have known that. None of them could. That morning was full of promises, and Thomas Whitmore believed in every single one of them. He believed he would survive the landing at Salerno, that he would write letters home every week, that by Christmas, maybe Easter at the latest, he would walk back through that door and lift William into the air, and everything would be exactly as he'd left it. The train rattled south through the English countryside, past fields still scarred with anti-aircraft positions, past villages where every other house flew a gold star in the window. Thomas sat with the other men from his unit, the 5th Battalion, Northumberland Fusiliers. Some played cards, some slept, some stared out the window at the country they were leaving, memorizing it in case memory was all they'd have left. Private James Fletcher, a boy barely 19 from Newcastle, sat beside Thomas and asked him about the wooden horse. Thomas told him about William, about how the boy loved animals, about how he wanted to be a veterinarian when he grew up, about how he'd cried for 3 days when their neighbor's cat had died. "You'll see him again," Fletcher said with the certainty of youth. "This war's almost over anyway. Everyone says so." Thomas nodded, but he'd heard those words before. They'd been saying it since Dunkirk, since El Alamein, since a dozen other battles that were supposed to be the turning point. The truth was simpler and more terrible. The war would end when it ended, and no amount of hoping could speed it along. The letters began arriving in late September. Margaret would find them on the mat by the door. Thomas's handwriting instantly recognizable. Neat, careful. The script of a man who'd left school at 14 but never stopped reading. She would save them until evening, until after William had finished his homework and eaten his dinner, and then they would sit together on the sofa, the same sofa where Thomas used to read to the boy before bed, and she would read his father's words aloud. "My dearest Margaret and Billy, we've reached Italy, though I cannot tell you exactly where. The weather is warm, too warm really, and everything is covered in dust. The locals wave as we pass through their villages, and the children run alongside our trucks asking for chocolate. Yesterday I gave away the last of my rations to a little girl who reminded me of Billy, though her eyes were darker, and she spoke a language I couldn't understand. Billy, I hope you are being good for your mother. I hope you are studying hard and helping with the chores. Remember what I told you. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you are afraid. The lads here are good men. Private Fletcher asks about you all the time. He wants to know if you've named the wooden horse yet. William had named it Courage, just as his father suggested. He carried it everywhere, to school, to the shops, to the Anderson shelter in the back garden when the occasional air raid siren still wailed. At night, he slept with it under his pillow, and sometimes Margaret would wake to find him holding whispered conversations with it, asking when his daddy was coming home. By October, the letters came less frequently. The news from Italy had turned grim. The Germans had established a defensive line across the mountains, and the Allied advance had slowed to a crawl. Every evening, Margaret would sit beside the wireless and listen to the BBC reports, trying to read between the lines, trying to understand what heavy casualties and fierce resistance meant for the man she'd married on a rainy April morning in 1935. November brought rain to London and snow to the Italian mountains. Thomas's letters spoke of cold so intense that men lost fingers to frostbite, of mud that swallowed trucks to their axles, of nights spent huddled in foxholes listening to the whistle of incoming shells. But he never complained. He asked about William's studies, about whether Margaret had enough coal for the winter, about the neighbor's new baby, and Mrs. Patterson's arthritis, and all the small details of life that kept him tethered to home. Billy, I think of you every day. When things get difficult here, I close my eyes and remember your smile. I remember teaching you to ride your bicycle in Victoria Park, how you scraped your knee but got right back on. That's courage, son. That's what will get us all through this. William wrote back in his careful child's handwriting, the letters full of misspellings and questions. He told his father about school, about how he'd gotten top marks in arithmetic, about the pigeon he'd found with a broken wing and nursed back to health. He asked when his father would be home. He asked this in every letter, and Margaret's heart broke each time she helped him form the words. Christmas came. Thomas sent a package, a small carved nativity scene, each figure no bigger than a fingernail, made during the long hours in the trenches. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each piece sanded smooth, each face given the suggestion of features. Margaret set it on the mantelpiece, and William would stand before it for hours, holding courage, imagining his father's hands creating something beautiful in the midst of something terrible. They didn't celebrate much that year. Margaret managed to find a small chicken on the black market, and they sang carols, just the two of them, their voices small in the cold flat. When William asked if they could leave a plate out for his father, just in case he came home, Margaret said yes and pretended not to cry as she placed it by the hearth. The letters continued into 1944. In January, Thomas wrote about the Battle of Monte Cassino, though he called it simply a difficult time. He wrote about Fletcher being wounded, shrapnel in the leg, and being sent to a hospital in Naples. He wrote about a moment of quiet when he'd seen an old Italian woman tending a small garden beside a ruined church, planting seeds in the middle of winter, an act of faith that moved him nearly to tears. There is so much destruction here, Billy, but there is also beauty. Yesterday I saw a bird, I think it was a swift, flying above the battlefield. It didn't care about the war, about borders or uniforms or any of it. It just flew. I like to think that's how God sees us. Just people, trying to find our way home. In February, the letters stopped. Margaret noticed the silence before William did. The boy was still young enough to believe that absence was temporary, that his father was simply busy, that a letter would arrive any day with a reasonable explanation. But Margaret had been a soldier's wife long enough to know that silence was its own kind of message. She went to the War Office on a Tuesday morning in late February, leaving William with her sister. The building on Whitehall was imposing, all stone and authority, filled with harried clerks and desperate women asking the same questions she'd come to ask. She waited for 3 hours on a hard wooden bench before a tired young man with spectacles called her name. Mrs. Whitmore? Regarding Private Thomas Whitmore, 5th Battalion, Northumberland Fusiliers. Yes, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I haven't heard from my husband in 6 weeks. His last letter was dated January 22nd. I need to know if there's been any news. The clerk shuffled through papers, his face carefully neutral. I see his name on the roster for the January offensive near Cassino. There were significant casualties in that action. But I'm afraid I don't have specific information about your husband's status. He's not listed among the confirmed dead, but he's also not among those reported wounded or taken prisoner. What does that mean? It means he's missing, Mrs. Whitmore. It means we simply don't know. The words hung in the air between them. Missing. Not dead, but not alive either. Suspended in some terrible limbo where hope and grief became indistinguishable from each other. When will you know? Margaret asked. These things take time. The fighting in Italy is confused. Units get separated. Records are lost. Sometimes men turn up weeks later, disoriented but alive. Sometimes... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Margaret walked home through streets that seemed to have lost their color. She stopped at a church, St. Paul's Covent Garden, and sat in a back pew, listening to the silence, trying to pray but finding no words. How do you pray when you don't know what to pray for? For life, for death, for the strength to endure not knowing. She told William that evening, choosing her words carefully. Daddy's letters might not come for a while. There's been a lot of fighting, and sometimes the mail gets delayed. But that doesn't mean anything bad has happened. It just means we have to be patient. William accepted this because children accept what they're told, especially when the alternative is too terrible to imagine. But something changed in him after that. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He stopped playing with other children. He would sit for hours with courage, having those whispered conversations. And now Margaret understood he was trying to keep his father alive through force of will. March brought the first crocuses pushing through the cold earth in Victoria Park. Margaret took William there on Sunday afternoons, and they would walk the same paths Thomas had walked with his son, and she would tell stories about his father, about how they'd met at a dance in 1933, about his terrible singing voice, about how he'd cried when William was born. Great heaving sobs of joy that embarrassed him for days after. Will he come home? William asked one day, standing beside the pond where ducks circled endlessly. I don't know, darling, Margaret said, because she'd promised herself she would never lie to her son. I hope so. I pray for it every night. But I don't know. In April, a letter arrived, but it wasn't from Thomas. It was from Private James Fletcher, writing from a hospital in Naples, his handwriting shaky from pain or medication or both. Dear Mrs. Whitmore, I hope this letter finds you and young William well. I'm writing to tell you what I know about your husband, which isn't much, but I thought you should hear it from someone who was there. We were in the mountains near Cassino on January 24th. The fighting was brutal. We'd been ordered to take a ridge held by German positions. Thomas was right beside me when the shelling started. One moment we were advancing together, and the next moment there was smoke and noise and chaos everywhere. When it cleared, I couldn't find him. I called his name, but there was no answer. I searched as long as I could before the medics took me away. I've asked around since then, but no one has seen him. Some of the lads were captured that day. Maybe he's in a prisoner of war camp. Maybe he's injured and in a hospital somewhere, unable to write. I wish I had better news. Your husband spoke of you and William constantly. He carried that photograph of you both everywhere. He showed me the wooden horse he'd carved for the boy. He is a good man, the best of us. Please tell William that his father loved him more than anything in this world. Tell him that the last thing Thomas said to me before the battle was, I'm going to get home to my boy. I'm sorry I can't tell you more. I hope he comes home safe. Yours sincerely, James Fletcher. Margaret read the letter twice, 3 times, until the words blurred together. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the box where she kept all of Thomas's letters. All these fragments of a man who might already be gone. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Church bells rang across London, and people danced in the streets, kissing strangers, weeping with relief. Margaret stood at her window watching the celebrations with William beside her, both of them silent. Around them, men were coming home, gaunt, exhausted, but alive. Every day brought reunions on train platforms, fathers lifted by children who barely remembered them, wives collapsing into arms they'd feared. They'd never feel again, but Thomas Whitmore didn't come home. The official telegram arrived in June. The War Office regrets to inform you that Private Thomas Whitmore is officially listed as missing in action, presumed dead. The words had a terrible finality to them, yet they offered no closure. Presumed dead wasn't dead. It was a guess, an assumption, a bureaucratic best estimate. Does this mean Daddy isn't coming home? William asked. He was 9 now, taller, his face losing the softness of early childhood. He still carried courage everywhere, though the wooden horse had been rubbed smooth by thousands of touches, its features worn away by devotion. I don't know, Margaret said again. because it was still the truth. The war is over, but it will take time for everyone to come home. We have to keep hoping. They held a memorial service in July, even though there was no body to bury. The church was half full. Neighbors, Thomas's old workmates from the factory, a few soldiers from his unit who'd made it home. Private Fletcher came on crutches, his legs still healing. He shook William's hand and told him, "Your father saved my life more than once. He was the bravest man I ever knew." After the service, Margaret planted a rose bush in their small back garden, a red one, Thomas's favorite color. She and William would tend it together, watering it through the dry summer, protecting it from frost in the winter. It became a ritual, a way of keeping Thomas present even in his absence. Years passed. William started secondary school. He grew into a quiet, serious boy, excellent in his studies, particularly mathematics and science. He stopped talking about his father except on certain days, birthdays, Christmas, the anniversary of that morning at King's Cross Station. But Margaret knew he thought about Thomas constantly. She'd find him sometimes, late at night, sitting by his window with courage, staring out at the London streets as if his father might appear around any corner. In 1947, Margaret received a letter from the Red Cross. They'd been searching for missing soldiers, cross-referencing prisoner of war records, hospital admissions, unidentified remains. They had no new information about Thomas Whitmore, but they wanted her to know they were still looking. She wrote back immediately, providing every detail she could remember. His height, his scars, his dental records, anything that might help identify him if he was ever found. The response came 6 months later. They'd found no trace of him. Not in any prisoner of war camp, not in any hospital, not among the unidentified dead who'd been buried in the Commonwealth war graves cemeteries scattered across Italy. Thomas Whitmore had simply vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. "Maybe he's still alive somewhere," William said when Margaret told him. He was 12 now, old enough to understand probability, old enough to know that hope at this point was almost certainly delusion. Maybe he lost his memory. Maybe he's in a village in Italy, trying to remember who he is. Maybe, Margaret said, though she'd long since stopped believing in maybes. William became obsessed with the idea. He learned Italian from library books. He studied maps of the Monte Cassino region, memorizing every mountain, every village. When he was 16, he announced his intention to travel to Italy as soon as he was old enough, to search for his father himself. Margaret didn't try to talk him out of it. She understood the need to do something, anything, to transform grief into action. In 1952, William turned 18. He'd finished school with top marks, earned a place at Cambridge to study medicine, but he deferred it for a year. He took the money he'd saved from working odd jobs, added it to what Margaret gave him from Thomas's war pension, and bought a ticket to Naples. William arrived in Italy in September 1952, 9 years after his father had made the same journey. The country had begun to heal from the war, but the scars were everywhere, buildings still in ruins, fields still pocked with shell craters, and in the mountains around Monte Cassino, the Commonwealth Cemetery where thousands of white headstones marched in perfect rows. He spent weeks there, reading every name, looking for his father even though he knew Thomas wasn't among the identified dead. He talked to local villagers, showing them the photograph he carried. Thomas at King's Cross Station, that smile frozen in time. Most shook their heads. One old woman claimed to remember English soldiers sheltering in her barn, but she couldn't say if one of them was the man in the picture. On a gray October morning, William climbed the mountain where the fiercest fighting had occurred. The path was overgrown now, but signs of battle remained. Rusted ammunition, fragments of equipment, the land itself torn and reshaped by violence. He reached the ridge that Fletcher had described in his letter, the place where his father had last been seen. He stood there for a long time, the wind carrying the scent of wild rosemary, and tried to feel something, his father's presence, a message, any connection to the man who'd carved him a wooden horse and promised to come home. But there was nothing, just wind and silence and the vast indifference of the mountains. That night, staying in a small pension in the valley, William met another visitor to the cemetery, an elderly Italian man named Giuseppe who'd lived in the region during the war. They shared a table at dinner, and William found himself telling the story of his father, of the smile at the station, of the years of waiting, of this final desperate search. Giuseppe listened carefully, then said something that changed everything. "Perhaps you're looking for the wrong thing. Your father promised to come home, yes? And perhaps he did. Perhaps he has been home all along." William didn't understand at first, but Giuseppe continued, his English rough but clear. "A man is not just a body. A man is also his actions, his love, the way he changes the people around him. Your father lives in you, in your mother, in every person who remembers his kindness. That is also a kind of coming home. That night, William took out courage for what he knew would be the last time. The wooden horse was barely recognizable now, worn nearly smooth by years of handling. But as he held it, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not grief, not hope, but acceptance. His father was gone. The man who'd smiled at King's Cross Station had died on an Italian mountain, his body claimed by the earth or the chaos of war. But he'd kept his promise in the only way he could. He'd come home in the memories, in the love, in the carved wooden horse that had carried a piece of him through 9 years of waiting. William returned to London in November. He found his mother tending the rosebush in the back garden, now grown tall and full, blooming even as winter approached. He told her about Italy, about the mountain, about Giuseppe's words. They stood together in the cold, and for the first time since that September morning in 1943, they wept, not with the sharp pain of fresh loss, but with the deeper, quieter grief of letting go. "He would be so proud of you," Margaret said. "You've become exactly the man he hoped you'd be." William went to Cambridge the following year. He studied medicine, became a doctor, specialized in pediatrics. He married a kind woman named Sarah, had 3 children of his own. He told them stories about their grandfather, the man who'd carved horses from scraps of wood, who'd smiled even in the face of terrible fear, who'd taught his son that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And when his own son asked about the war, about the sacrifice, about why his grandfather had gone to fight, William would take out the wooden horse, kept all these years in a small velvet box, and say, "Because sometimes love means leaving. Sometimes it means going into the darkness so that others can stay in the light." Your grandfather understood that. He left with a smile because he wanted me to remember joy instead of sorrow. That was his last gift to me, and I've tried to honor it every day of my life. The rose bush in the garden outlived Margaret. When she died in 1967, William transplanted it to his own home, and later his children transplanted it to theirs. It blooms every June, red petals like drops of blood and love, a living memorial to Thomas Whitmore, who left with a smile and never came home, but who kept his promise in ways no one could have anticipated. Because he did come home, in the courage of his son, in the kindness of his grandchildren, in every person who heard his story and resolved to face their own fears with the same quiet determination. That's what war does, in the end. It takes fathers from sons, but it can't take the love that remains. It can't take the memory of a smile, or the smooth wood of a toy horse, or the promise that courage, once given, never truly dies. The men and women who left for war carried more than weapons. They carried the hopes of everyone they loved. Some came home in body. Some came home in spirit. Some, like Thomas Whitmore, came home in the love that refused to die, in the memories that passed from generation to generation, in the simple truth that a father's promise transcends even death itself. If this story touched you, please leave a comment below sharing how you honor those who've sacrificed for others, and consider subscribing to hear more stories of courage, love, and the unbreakable bonds between fathers and sons. These stories matter. These memories matter. And as long as we tell them, those we've lost are never truly gone.